Have you ever been so desperate that you'd knock on the devil's door asking for salvation? I'm talking about that moment when your world has collapsed so completely that the most dangerous choice feels like the only choice. Maybe you're from Texas or Arizona, somewhere close to the border where these stories aren't just fiction but headlines in your local news. If you are, you know exactly how thin the line is between safety and chaos, between the law and those who operate beyond it. Valentina Cruz knew that line had never been thinner than it was at 11:53 on a Tuesday night in October, rain hammering against her windshield as her 10-year-old Honda finally surrendered to the inevitable. Steam rose from under the hood like a white flag of defeat, and the engine shuddered into silence on a stretch of desert highway that belonged to no one and everyone. At 24, Valentina had thought she understood fear. 3 years of teaching art to middle school kids in El Paso had shown her plenty, from the subtle signs of abuse in her students' drawings to the gang colors that crept into the halls like poison ivy. But this was different. This was the kind of fear that lived in your bones, that made every shadow a threat and every sound a potential death sentence. Diego Morales had made sure of that. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. The rain had started 2 hours ago, just after she'd thrown everything she could fit into 2 duffel bags and run. Just after she'd finally accepted what everyone had been trying to tell her for months, that her ex-boyfriend wasn't just controlling and violent, he was connected. Connected to people who made problems disappear permanently. The threatening texts had started 3 weeks ago. Pictures of her classroom, her apartment, her sister Maria walking to work. Then the calls, Diego's voice smooth and dangerous through the static. You can't hide from me, Valentina. You know what I'm capable of. You know what my friends are capable of. She didn't know. She'd seen the news reports, heard the whispered stories in the teacher's lounge. The Hermanos Sangre Cartel didn't just control drug routes, they controlled people. And Diego, despite his nice clothes and his job at the bank, despite the way he'd charmed her family for 8 months, was one of them. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape around her in stark, terrifying detail. She was in the middle of nowhere, 20 miles from the nearest town, 50 from anything resembling civilization. But there, perhaps half a mile up the winding road that branched off the highway, she could see lights. Not the cold fluorescence of a gas station or the warm glow of a farmhouse, but something else entirely. Security lights, she realized. Professional, expensive, and casting their harsh illumination over what looked like a fortress. She knew where she was now. This was Rafael Mendoza's territory. El Lobo. They called him in the whispers that followed certain names through certain neighborhoods. The Wolf. Leader of the Lobos de Hierro cartel, the Iron Wolves who controlled everything from drug routes to protection rackets across 3 states. If Diego was dangerous, Rafael Mendoza was death incarnate. But as she sat in her dead car, rain drumming against the roof like bullets, Valentina realized something that should have terrified her, but instead filled her with a strange, desperate calm. She was already dead if she stayed on this road. Diego would find her by morning, or his friends would, and then it would be over. At least with Rafael Mendoza, she had a choice to make. She grabbed her phone, the screen cracked from where she dropped it in her haste to leave, and checked the battery. 12%. No signal anyway, not out here in the dead zone between civilizations. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the dusty road into a river of mud that would be impassable by dawn. There was no going back. Diego was behind her, somewhere in the darkness, hunting. The highway ahead was empty, offering nothing but exposure and vulnerability. But up that winding road, past the security lights and the warnings that wise people heeded, was the most dangerous man in the state. Maybe dangerous enough to protect her from the monster she was running from. Valentina pulled the hood of her jacket up and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical blow, cold and sharp, soaking through her clothes within seconds. Her shoes, practical flats meant for classroom floors, slipped and slid in the mud as she began the trek up the hill. Each step was a commitment, each forward movement a rejection of the safe, sensible world she'd known before tonight. The road was longer than it had looked from her car, winding through scrub brush and over rocky outcroppings that turned into waterfalls in the storm. By the time she reached the gate, Her teeth were chattering, and her legs were shaking from more than just the cold. The mansion beyond was even more intimidating up close. All Spanish colonial architecture and bulletproof glass, with security cameras tracking her approach like predator eyes. The gate was wrought iron and steel, 12 feet high and topped with razor wire that glinted in the security lights. An intercom was mounted on a stone pillar, its red light indicating it was armed and recording. For a moment, Valentina hesitated. Once she pressed that button, once she announced herself to the most dangerous man she'd ever heard of, there would be no taking it back. But then thunder crashed overhead, and in the echo she heard something else. The distant rumble of engines on the highway below. Diego had found her car. She pressed the button. The intercom crackled to life, but no voice emerged. Just the sound of someone listening, waiting, evaluating the threat level of a soaked young woman standing in their storm. "Please," she whispered into the speaker, then cleared her throat and tried again. "Please, I need to speak with Rafael Mendoza. I need his help." Static answered her, stretching into seconds that felt like hours. Then the gate began to swing open with a mechanical whir that seemed impossibly loud in the storm. The walk to the front door was shorter than the climb to the gate, but felt longer. Motion sensors tracked her progress, and she could feel eyes watching from windows she couldn't see. The front door was massive, carved wood and iron that looked like it could withstand a siege. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated again. What was she doing? This man was a killer, a criminal, someone who lived by rules she didn't understand and couldn't follow. But then she thought about Diego's hands around her throat, about his threats against Maria, about the way he'd smiled when he told her exactly what he would do to her when he found her. She knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if he'd been watching her approach. Rafael Mendoza was taller than she'd expected, probably 6'3", with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe and dark hair that was perfectly styled despite the late hour. His face was angular and sharp, with green-gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail about her in the space of a heartbeat. He was maybe 35, dressed in expensive casual clothes that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. For a moment, they just looked at each other. She was probably not what he'd been expecting, a half-drowned art teacher with desperation written across her features. He was exactly what she'd feared, and somehow more human than the stories had suggested. "I'm Valentina Cruz," she said, her voice steadier than she'd hoped. "I need you to kill someone for me." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their directness. She hadn't planned to say it like that, hadn't planned to lead with the nuclear option, but there it was. The truth, raw and desperate and impossible to take back. Raphael's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift in his eyes. Not surprise, exactly, but interest. He stepped back from the door, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he might close it in her face, leave her standing in the storm with nowhere left to run. Instead, he said, "You're hurt." She looked down at herself, saw the bruises on her wrists that her jacket hadn't hidden, the cut on her cheek where Diego's class ring had caught her during their last fight. She'd forgotten about them in the panic of running, but they were visible now under the harsh light of his foyer. "Come inside," Raphael said, and his voice was gentler than she'd expected, though no less commanding. "You're bleeding." She stepped across the threshold into warmth and safety, or at least the illusion of both. The door closed behind her with a solid thunk that seemed to seal her fate. She was inside Rafael Mendoza's home now, under the protection of the most feared man in 3 states. The question was whether she'd just made the smartest decision of her life, or the last one she'd ever make. The foyer of Rafael Mendoza's home was nothing like Valentina had expected. Where she'd imagined cold marble and ostentatious displays of wealth, she found warm terracotta tiles and understated elegance. Original artwork lined the walls, pieces she recognized from her art history classes, mixed with contemporary works that spoke of genuine appreciation rather than mere acquisition. It was the home of someone who understood beauty, not just power. But it was the gentleness in Raphael's hands as he guided her to a leather chair that truly caught her off guard. "Sit," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but tempered with concern. "Let me see that cut." Valentina sank into the chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading. leaving behind bone-deep weariness and the delayed shock of what she'd just done. She'd knocked on a cartel leader's door at midnight and asked him to commit murder. The insanity of it was starting to settle in. Raphael disappeared through an archway, returning moments later with a first aid kit that looked professionally stocked. He pulled up a chair across from her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that reminded her of cedar and rain. "This might sting," he warned, producing an antiseptic wipe. She flinched as he cleaned the cut on her cheek, but his touch was impossibly gentle for hands that she knew had done terrible things. "Who did this to you?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made her look up into those green-gray eyes. They weren't cold, as she'd expected, but filled with a controlled fury that was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. "Diego Morales," she said. "My ex-boyfriend. We broke up 3 months ago, but he won't let it go. He said he owns me, that I'll never be free of him." Raphael's jaw tightened as he applied a butterfly bandage to her cheek. "Tell me about Diego Morales." So she did. The words came pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. 3 months of fear and isolation finally finding voice. She told him about Diego's charm in the beginning, how he'd swept her off her feet with expensive dinners and romantic gestures, how the control had started small, comments about her clothes, her friends, her job, how it had escalated to isolation, then threats, then violence. "He works at First National Bank," she said. "Assistant manager. But he has connections, people he knows from his neighborhood. Hermanos sangre." Raphael's hands stilled on the antiseptic wipe. "Hermanos sangre," he repeated, and his voice was deadly quiet. "You know them," Valentina said, and it wasn't a question. "I know them." Raphael finished cleaning a scrape on her wrist, his touch clinical now, but no less careful. "They're rivals. Competitors for territory we've held for 15 years. If Diego Morales is connected to them, then this isn't just about an obsessed ex-boyfriend anymore." "What do you mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "I mean he's using you to get to me." Raphael sat back in his chair, those sharp eyes studying her face. "You showing up here tonight, asking for my help, it's not coincidence. He wants you desperate enough to run to his enemies. The question is why?" Valentina felt the blood drain from her face. "I never told him about you. I swear, I never even knew where you lived until tonight." "But you knew who I was," Raphael said. "When you pressed that intercom button, you knew exactly whose door you were knocking on." "Everyone knows who you are," she whispered. "In certain neighborhoods, in certain families, your name means something. Protection or death, depending on which side you're on," Raphael said. "So which side are you on, Valentina Cruz?" The question hung between them like a challenge. She thought about her life before tonight, her carefully ordered world of lesson plans and parent conferences and weekend dinners with her family. That world felt impossibly distant now, separated from this moment by more than just a midnight drive through the storm. "I'm on the side that keeps me alive," she said finally. "I'm on the side that keeps my sister safe." Raphael nodded as if this was the answer he'd been waiting for. "Good. Smart." He stood, towering over her in a way that should have been intimidating, but somehow wasn't. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we figure out exactly what Diego Morales wants and how to give him the opposite." "I can't impose," she started, but Raphael cut her off with a look. "It's not a request," he said. "You came to me for protection, which means you're under my protection until this is resolved. Nothing will happen to you while you're under my roof." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. This was Rafael Mendoza making a promise, and she understood instinctively that he didn't make them lightly. He showed her to a guest room on the second floor, spacious and comfortable with its own bathroom and a window that looked out over the compound's grounds. Security lights illuminated the perimeter, and she could see guards patrolling at intervals that spoke of military precision. "There are clothes in the dresser," Raphael said from the doorway. "Different sizes. You're not the first person to arrive here with nothing but what you're wearing." "Thank you," she said, but he was already turning away. "Raphael," she called, and he stopped. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. For all you know, this could be some kind of setup." He turned back to face her, and for a moment his expression was unguarded. "Because I know what it's like to run from monsters," he said quietly. "And because some things are worth protecting, even from people like me." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone with questions and a safety she hadn't felt in months. Valentina woke to the smell of coffee and something that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and for a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The storm, the desperate drive, the impossible request she'd made to the most dangerous man she'd ever met. She dressed in clothes from the dresser, jeans and a soft blue sweater that fit well enough to make her wonder about the other women who had sought refuge here. The thought should have bothered her, but instead she found herself curious about Rafael Mendoza's other acts of protection. She found him in the kitchen, standing at the stove with his back to her. He was cooking eggs, she realized, and the domesticity of it was so at odds with everything she knew about him that she stopped in the doorway just to watch. His hands were steady as he flipped the eggs, the same hands that had tended her injuries with such care the night before. But these were also the hands of El Lobo, the Iron Wolf, hands that had signed death sentences and pulled triggers and built an empire on violence and fear. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "I hope you slept. Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, stepping into the kitchen. "Thank you for the clothes." He glanced at her over his shoulder, and she saw approval in his eyes as he took in her appearance. "Blue is your color," he said, then turned back to the stove as if the comment had been purely practical. Valentina felt heat rise in her cheeks, an awareness of him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way he moved, the quiet confidence in every gesture. This was dangerous territory, being attracted to a man like Rafael Mendoza, but her body seemed to have missed that particular memo. "I made breakfast," he said, plating eggs alongside toast and fresh fruit. "We need to talk about Diego, but you need to eat first." They sat at a breakfast bar that looked out over the compound's central courtyard, where men in expensive suits conducted quiet conversations and others in tactical gear maintained equipment she chose not to examine too closely. It was a reminder of what Raphael's world really was, even as he handed her orange juice and asked if she wanted more coffee. "I had my people look into Diego Morales last night," Raphael said as they ate. "He's not just connected to Hermano Sangre, he's their accountant. Money laundering, primarily, but also recruitment and intelligence gathering." "Intelligence gathering," Valentina repeated, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Information about rival operations. About people who might be useful leverage. About weaknesses that can be exploited." Raphael's eyes were serious as they met hers. "Your relationship with him wasn't accidental, Valentina. You were targeted from the beginning." The eggs turned to ash in her mouth as the implications sank in. Everything, all of it, the romance and the charm, and even the escalating control, had been calculated. She'd been a job, an assignment, a means to an end she still didn't understand. "But why?" she whispered. "I'm nobody. I teach middle school art. I live in a studio apartment and drive a car that's older than some of my students." "You're nobody now," Raphael said gently. "But your father was Miguel Cruz." The world tilted sideways. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, had spent her entire adult life trying to distance herself from the legacy it carried. Miguel Cruz, who had run guns for 3 different cartels before his conscience caught up with him, who had tried to go straight and paid for it with his life when Valentina was 16. "You knew my father," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I knew of him." Raphael's voice was carefully neutral. "He had information that could have destroyed my operation 10 years ago. Information that died with him. Information that Diego thinks I might know," Valentina said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "Information that could still destroy me, if it exists," Raphael confirmed. "Which means keeping you safe isn't just about protection anymore. It's about survival." 3 days had passed since Valentina Cruz had knocked on Rafael Mendoza's door, and she was beginning to understand that safety could be more unsettling than danger. At least with danger, you knew where you stood. Safety, she was learning, came with complications she hadn't anticipated. Like the way Raphael made coffee in the morning, his movements efficient and precise as he prepared 2 cups without asking if she wanted any. Like the way he'd quietly stocked the guest bathroom with toiletries in her exact shade preferences, as if he'd been studying her face for clues. Like the way he seemed to know when she needed space and when she needed the comfort of another person's presence. Most unsettling of all was the way she'd begun to look forward to these small intimacies. She found him in his study on the 3rd morning, surrounded by walls of books and artwork that spoke of a mind far more complex than the reputation of El Lobo suggested. He was reading, his dark hair catching the morning light through tall windows, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply watch him. Without the constant tension of crisis, without the immediate threat hanging over them both, she could see past the dangerous reputation to the man underneath. He was beautiful, she realized with a start. Not handsome in the conventional way, but beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes were. All sharp angles and controlled power, like a blade that had been forged by a master craftsman. "You're staring," he said without looking up from his book, but there was amusement in his voice rather than accusation. Heat flooded her cheeks as she stepped fully into the room. "I was looking at your art collection," she said, which wasn't entirely a lie. The pieces on his walls were extraordinary, ranging from classical paintings to contemporary sculptures that must have cost more than her annual salary. Raphael set his book aside and stood, moving to stand beside a painting she'd been admiring. "Do you recognize it?" he asked. Valentina stepped closer, studying the brushstrokes and composition. "It's a Remedios Vero," she said after a moment. "I've only seen her work in textbooks. This is incredible." "You know her work," Raphael said, and there was something like surprise in his voice. "I teach art history, remember." Valentina moved to the next piece, a contemporary sculpture that seemed to capture light and hold it prisoner. "Though I have to admit, most of what I know comes from museum catalogs and library books. I've never seen originals like these outside of major museums." Raphael watched her examine his collection with an intensity that made her hyper-aware of his presence. She could feel his eyes following her movements as she moved from piece to piece, see the way his expression shifted when she paused before a particular sculpture. "This one," she said, stopping before a bronze piece that seemed to capture a moment of transformation, something between human and animal caught in eternal motion. "It's magnificent. The artist understands the tension between civilization and wildness. It reminds me of home," Raphael said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "My grandmother had a similar piece in her courtyard in Michoacán. She used to tell me stories about the Nahuals, shapeshifters who could walk between the human and animal worlds." Valentina turned to look at him, surprised by the personal revelation. "You grew up in Mexico." "Until I was 12, he confirmed. "Then my family moved to El Paso for better opportunities." Better opportunities that turned into survival when the violence followed us north. There was something in his voice that made her want to ask more, but before she could find the words, he was moving again, leading her to another section of the room. "Tell me about your teaching," he said, settling into a chair by the window and gesturing for her to take the one across from him. "What do you love about it?" "Everything," she said without hesitation. "The way kids see the world differently when you give them permission to be creative. The moment when a student who thinks they can't draw realizes they've been making art all along. The way art can help them process emotions they don't have words for yet." As she talked, she watched Raphael's face change. The careful control he maintained in all their interactions softened, replaced by something that looked like wonder. He asked questions, real questions about her methods and her students and her hopes for what art could do in their lives. "You love them," he said when she paused to catch her breath. "Your students. The way you talk about them, it's clear they're not just a job to you." "Children deserve protection," she said simply. "They deserve adults who believe in their potential and fight for their futures. Too many of my kids don't have that at home." Raphael was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those green-gray eyes that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. "There's something I want to show you," he said finally. He led her through the house to a terrace she hadn't seen before, a space that overlooked the valley below where the lights of the city twinkled in the distance. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with art in the first place. They sat in comfortable chairs, drinks forgotten on the table between them as the day slowly surrendered to evening. It was Raphael who broke the silence, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "I had a sister," he said without preamble. "Isabella. She was 8 years younger than me, had this laugh that could fill an entire room. She wanted to be a teacher, like you." Valentina heard the past tense and felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What happened to her?" "She was in the wrong place at the wrong time," Raphael said, His hands clenched on the arms of his chair. A rival group decided to send my family a message while I was building my reputation. They took her from school, kept her for 3 days while they made demands I couldn't meet. Valentina reached across the space between them without thinking, covering his hand with hers. His skin was warm, but she could feel the tension thrumming through him like a live wire. By the time we found her, she was gone, Raphael continued, his voice steady but hollow. She was 15 years old and she died because someone wanted to hurt me. Because I wasn't fast enough, smart enough, strong enough to protect the one person who mattered most. I'm sorry, Valentina whispered, inadequate words for an inadequate world where children paid for adult sins. Every person I've protected since then has been for her, Raphael said, turning his hand palm up to capture hers. Every threat I've eliminated, every safe place I've created, it's all been an attempt to keep someone else from losing what I lost. The weight of his confession settled between them, heavy and precious and dangerous. Valentina understood now why he'd opened his door to her, why he'd tended her injuries with such care, why his protection felt so absolute. She wasn't just a woman in trouble to him. She was every person he'd failed to save, starting with Isabella. The moment stretched between them, charged with understanding and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. Raphael's eyes were dark in the fading light, focused on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. She was aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth of his hand under hers, of the way his gaze dropped to her lips for just a moment before returning to her eyes. He leaned forward slightly, and she found herself mirroring the movement without conscious thought. The space between them felt electric, full of possibility and want, and the kind of connection that could change everything. Then alarms began to sound. The moment shattered as Raphael was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to the gun she now realized he always carried. Security lights blazed to life across the compound, and she could hear voices shouting orders in rapid Spanish. "Stay here," Raphael commanded, his voice transformed from gentle to deadly in a heartbeat. "Don't move until I come back for you." But he was already gone, moving with lethal grace toward whatever threat had breached their sanctuary. Valentina sat frozen in her chair, the taste of almost on her lips and the sound of danger in her ears. It was 20 minutes before Raphael returned, his expression grim but no longer alarm-sharp. "False alarm," he said, but there was something in his voice that suggested it hadn't been entirely false. "Motion sensors picking up coyotes on the perimeter." Valentina nodded, but she could see the tension still riding his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the darkness beyond the terrace. Something had happened, something more than coyotes. "Raphael," she started, but he was already helping her to her feet. "We should go inside," he said. "It's getting cold." But as they walked back toward the house, he told her what had really triggered the alarms. Diego Morales had been spotted at her school, asking questions about her schedule, her habits, her relationships with other teachers. "He's escalating," Raphael said quietly as they reached her room. "Getting bolder. Tomorrow I'm putting additional security on your sister and your mother." "How did you know about them?" Valentina asked, though part of her already understood. "I make it my business to know about the people under my protection," Raphael said simply. "Your family's safety is your safety." Standing in the hallway outside her door, the space between them felt different than it had on the terrace. Charged still, but with awareness rather than anticipation. She could see the man who had almost kissed her in the fading light, but she could also see El Lobo, the protector who would do whatever it took to keep her world safe. For the first time since she'd knocked on his door 3 nights ago, Valentina realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Diego, not of the threats he represented, not even of the dangerous world she'd entered. She was afraid of something else entirely. She was afraid of how right this felt, how natural it had become to trust Rafael Mendoza with not just her safety, but with pieces of herself she'd never shared with anyone. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying weight far beyond gratitude for protection. Raphael's eyes searched her face in the dim hallway light, and she saw the moment he understood what she really meant. "For everything," she added. "Sleep well, Valentina," he said, her name soft on his lips like a promise. "Tomorrow we figure out how to end this." As she closed the door behind her, Valentina realized that ending it was the last thing she wanted. Not the threat, not Diego's pursuit, but this. Whatever this was becoming between them, she wasn't ready for it to be over. She was in love with Rafael Mendoza, she realized with crystal clarity. She was in love with the most dangerous man she'd ever met, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt completely safe. 2 weeks had passed since Valentina's midnight arrival, and she was beginning to understand that Rafael Mendoza's world operated by rules she'd never learned but somehow intuited. Like the way his men nodded respectfully when she passed them in the corridors, not because they'd been ordered to, but because they'd accepted her as part of Rafael's inner circle. Like the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, not from suspicion but from respect for what she represented to their leader. She was sitting in the kitchen with Sophia, Rafael's housekeeper and the closest thing to a maternal figure in his life, learning to make mole the way Rafael's grandmother had taught him. Sophia was a small woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and gentle hands, and she'd taken to Valentina with a warmth that felt like coming home. "He's different with you here," Sophia said quietly, stirring the complex sauce that would take hours to perfect. "More at peace. I haven't seen him smile this much since he was a boy." Valentina felt heat rise in her cheeks as she chopped chocolate for the mole. "I don't know what you mean." Sophia laughed, a rich sound that filled the kitchen. "Mija, I've been watching that man build walls around his heart for 15 years. You're the first person who's made him want to tear them down." Before Valentina could respond, voices echoed from the main corridor, Raphael's among them, but raised in a way she'd never heard before. Angry, but controlled, the way a predator might sound before it struck. "Stay here," Sophia said, but Valentina was already moving toward the sound. She found Raphael in his office with 3 of his lieutenants, men she'd come to recognize over the past 2 weeks. Marcus, his second-in-command, was a compact man with intelligent eyes who spoke 5 languages and could kill with his bare hands. Diego, not her ex but Raphael's cousin, handled logistics with the kind of precision that came from military training. And Carlos, the youngest, who looked at Raphael with the devotion of a son toward a father. They were standing around Raphael's desk, examining photographs that made Valentina's stomach turn cold even from across the room. "What's happening?" she asked, and all 4 men turned toward her with expressions that ranged from protective to grim. "Nothing for you to worry about," Raphael said, but his voice was tight in a way that told her it was everything to worry about. "Don't lie to me," she said, stepping fully into the room. "I've been living here for 2 weeks. I know when something's wrong." Raphael's jaw tightened as he exchanged looks with his men. It was Marcus who spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. "Diego Morales made a move on one of our business operations last night. Used information only someone close to you would know." "Information about what?" Valentina asked, but she was already moving closer to the desk where the photographs lay scattered. What she saw made her legs weak. Pictures of her sister Maria leaving work, getting into her car, walking to her apartment. Pictures of her mother at the grocery store, at church, talking with neighbors. Pictures that had been taken recently, within the last few days. "He's watching my family," she whispered. "He's using your family," Raphael corrected, his voice hard as granite. "Every move they make, he's documenting. Building a profile of their habits, their vulnerabilities, their relationships." "Why?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "Because he knows you're here," Marcus said quietly. "And he knows that threatening them is the fastest way to get you to come out of hiding." Valentina stared at the photographs, at her sister's bright smile captured without her knowledge, at her mother's careful progress across an icy parking lot. They were living their lives normally while being hunted like prey, and it was her fault for bringing this danger into their world. "I have to leave," she said suddenly. "I have to go to them. Get them somewhere safe. End this before someone gets hurt." "No," Raphael said, the single word carrying absolute authority. "You don't understand," she continued, turning to face him with desperation in her voice. "This is my fault. I brought this to your door, and now my family is paying for it. I won't let them be hurt because of my choices." "Your choices," Raphael repeated, moving around the desk toward her with predatory grace. "Your choice was to survive. Your choice was to seek protection from someone capable of providing it. Your choice was to trust me with your life. Are you taking that back now?" "I'm trying to protect the people I love," she shot back, anger flaring to match his. "Something you should understand better than anyone." "Don't," Raphael said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Don't throw Isabella in my face. Not about this. Then don't ask me to stand by while my family becomes targets, Valentina said, stepping closer to him until they were almost touching. I won't hide behind your walls while the people who matter most to me are in danger. You're not going anywhere, Raphael said, his hands coming up to frame her face with surprising gentleness despite the steel in his voice. You belong with me now. Under my protection, in my world, in my life. I'm not letting you walk back into danger because you're afraid. I'm not afraid, she said, but they both knew it was a lie. You're terrified, Raphael said, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones. Not of Diego, not of what he might do to your family. You're afraid of this, of what's happening between us, of how real it's become. The words hung between them like a challenge, and Valentina felt something shift in the space where they stood. She was aware of his hands on her face, of the way his eyes had darkened as they searched hers, of the barely contained tension in his body. You're right, she whispered. I'm terrified. Good, Raphael said, and then he was kissing her. It wasn't the gentle, tentative kiss she might have expected from their near-miss on the terrace. This was claiming, possessive, full of weeks of restrained desire finally unleashed. His mouth moved against hers with the same controlled intensity he brought to everything else, and she found herself melting into him despite the audience they'd forgotten. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Raphael's forehead rested against hers. You're not leaving, he said quietly. We protect your family together, or not at all. Together, she repeated, testing the word on her lips. Together, he confirmed, and in that moment she understood that he wasn't just talking about the current crisis. He was talking about everything that came after. The sound of Marcus clearing his throat reminded them they weren't alone. Raphael stepped back slightly, but kept his hands on her shoulders, as if anchoring her to him. What's the plan? Valentina asked, and the way Raphael's eyes lit up told her she'd said exactly the right thing. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. They would move her family to a safe house under Raphael's protection, but they would make it look like Valentina had left his compound to join them. Diego would follow the trail, expecting to find all of them together and vulnerable. Instead, he would find Raphael waiting. It meant using her family as bait, even if they would be perfectly safe. It meant trusting Raphael's men with the lives of the people she loved most. It meant fully accepting that her old life was over and this dangerous new world was her reality. It also meant staying close to Raphael during the most dangerous part, something he insisted on despite her protests. You're not going anywhere I can't see you, he'd said when she suggested hiding separately. We do this together, or we don't do it at all. That night, as they finalized the details with his team, Valentina found herself watching Raphael in a way she never had before. Not as El Lobo, the feared cartel leader, but as the man who had kissed her in front of his most trusted lieutenants and declared her part of his world. The man who was risking everything to keep her family safe. When the meeting ended and his men dispersed to make preparations, they found themselves alone in his office with the weight of what was coming hanging between them. Are you sure about this? She asked, though she wasn't entirely sure what this she meant. The plan, the kiss, the way everything had changed between them in the space of a heartbeat. I'm sure, Raphael said, moving to stand before her. About all of it. She looked up into his green-gray eyes and saw her own certainty reflected back at her. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever dangers they faced, they would face them together. She belonged with him now, in his world and in his life, and the thought didn't terrify her anymore. When he kissed her again, soft and sweet this time instead of desperate and claiming, she kissed him back with all the trust and hope and love she'd been afraid to acknowledge. When he took her hand and led her from the office toward his room instead of hers, she followed without hesitation. Later, lying in Raphael's arms with moonlight streaming through his windows, Valentina marveled at how completely her world had changed. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a frightened woman running from a violent ex-boyfriend. Tonight, she was a woman in love with the most dangerous man in 3 states, planning to use herself as bait to end a threat that could destroy them both. The woman she'd been would have been terrified by the transformation. The woman she was now felt only peace, wrapped in the arms of a man who would kill to protect her and had somehow learned to live because of her love. Tomorrow would bring danger and violence, and the final confrontation that would determine their future. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. The call came at 4 in the morning, Raphael's secure phone buzzing with the kind of urgency that meant blood was already spilled or about to be. Valentina woke to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, his back rigid as he listened to Marcus report what had gone wrong with their carefully laid plan. They took her, Raphael said when he ended the call, his voice hollow in a way that made Valentina's stomach plummet. Diego's people grabbed your sister from the safe house. 2 of my men are dead. The words hit her like physical blows, each one stealing more air from her lungs until she couldn't breathe. Maria, her baby sister who still called her for advice about boys and brought her terrible poetry to read. Maria, who had been in danger because Valentina had fallen in love with a man whose world was built on violence. How? She whispered, but Raphael was already moving, pulling on clothes with the efficient movements of someone preparing for war. Inside job, he said, his voice flat with controlled rage. Someone on Diego's payroll in my organization. Someone who knew the safe house location, the security protocols, the shift changes. Valentina felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. This was her fault. Every choice she'd made since knocking on Raphael's door had led to this moment, to her sister being taken by a monster because Valentina had been too selfish to stay away from the man she loved. I'm going with you, she said, sliding out of bed and reaching for her clothes. No, Raphael said without turning around. You're staying here where you're safe. This is what Diego wants, to draw you out. I won't give him that satisfaction. She's my sister, Valentina said, pulling on jeans with shaking hands. My responsibility. My fault she's in this situation to begin with. Raphael spun to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not just anger, but fear. Raw, undisguised terror that made her heart clench. I won't lose you too, he said quietly. I can't lose you too. The reference to Isabella hung between them. The sister he hadn't been able to save. The guilt he'd carried for 15 years. Valentina crossed to him and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. You won't lose me, she said firmly. But I'm not hiding here while my sister pays for my choices. We do this together, or I find another way to do it alone. Raphael's jaw worked as he stared down at her, and she could see the war being fought behind his eyes. The protector in him wanted to lock her away, keep her safe no matter the cost. But the man who loved her understood that some things were worth the risk. You stay behind me, he said finally. You do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. And if something goes wrong, if this turns into a bloodbath, you run. Promise me. I promise, she said, though they both knew it was a lie. The warehouse where Diego was holding Maria sat on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings that provided too many escape routes and too much cover. Raphael's men had surrounded the perimeter within an hour, moving with the kind of precision that came from years of working together in situations where mistakes meant death. Valentina crouched behind an overturned car with Raphael, watching him coordinate the assault through hand signals and whispered commands. This was El Lobo in his element, the dangerous man whose reputation had been built on moments like this. She could see why his enemies feared him and his men followed him without question. The warehouse had 3 entrances, Marcus reported through their earpieces. Diego has at least 6 men inside, probably more. Your sister is being held in the office area, 2nd floor. Alive? Raphael asked, and Valentina's heart stopped until Marcus confirmed that yes, Maria appeared unharmed. The plan was surgical in its simplicity. Raphael's team would create multiple diversions while a small strike force entered through the loading dock. Diego would expect Valentina to come charging in, emotional and desperate. He wouldn't expect Rafael Mendoza to arrive with the cold calculation of a predator who'd been planning this moment for weeks. Remember, Raphael said to her as they prepared to move. Stay close, stay quiet, and trust me. I trust you, she said, and meant it completely. The loading dock entrance was guarded by 2 men who never saw Raphael's team coming. Marcus and Diego, Raphael's cousin, moved like shadows, eliminating the threats with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of extensive training. Valentina followed Raphael through the opening, her heart hammering against her ribs but her hands steady. Inside, The warehouse was a maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment that created deep shadows and multiple levels of concealment. Raphael moved through it like he'd been here before, leading them toward the office area where Diego was holding Maria. They found the stairs guarded by 3 more men, and this time the violence wasn't silent. Gunfire erupted in short, controlled bursts, and Valentina pressed herself against a concrete pillar as Raphael and his men engaged the enemy with lethal precision. It was over in seconds, 3 bodies on the floor, and Raphael already moving toward the stairs. "Stay here," he told her, but she was already following him up the metal steps. The office area was a series of rooms with windows that looked out over the warehouse floor. They found Diego in the largest one, standing behind Maria, who was tied to a chair with tape over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she was alive and apparently unharmed. Diego looked exactly as Valentina remembered him, handsome in a conventional way with dark hair and expensive clothes that couldn't hide the predator underneath. But there was something desperate in his eyes now, the look of a man who'd played his final card and knew it might not be enough. "Valentina," he said with false warmth as she appeared behind Raphael in the doorway. "Finally decided to join the party." "Let her go," Valentina said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You want me, here I am. Let Maria go, and we can talk." Diego laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Talk? About what?" "About how you ran to my enemies the moment things got difficult between us. About how you've been playing house with Rafael Mendoza while I've been trying to build a life for us." "Build a life," Raphael said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the room. "Is that what you call threatening her family and stalking her for months?" "You don't understand what she means to me," Diego said, his grip tightening on the gun he held pressed to Maria's head. "What we had together, what we could have again if she'd just come home. What we had was control and abuse," Valentina said, taking a step forward despite Raphael's warning hand on her arm. "What you want isn't love, Diego. It's possession." "She belongs with me," Diego said, his voice rising with desperation. "Not with some cartel killer who'll get her murdered the first time his enemies want to send a message." The irony was almost funny, Valentina thought. Diego warning her about the dangers of Raphael's world while holding her sister hostage with a gun to her head. "You're right about one thing," Raphael said quietly, and Valentina heard something in his voice that made her blood run cold. "She doesn't belong in a world of violence and death. But she chose it anyway, because she loves me. And I love her enough to burn this whole city down before I let you take her away." The conversation was over before Diego realized it had ended. Raphael moved with the lethal grace of a predator, crossing the room in 3 quick steps while Diego was still processing the threat. The gun flew from Diego's hand, and Maria's chair toppled sideways as the 2 men crashed into the desk. Valentina rushed to her sister, cutting the ropes and pulling the tape from her mouth, while Raphael and Diego fought with brutal efficiency. But it wasn't really a fight, she realized. It was an execution that Diego had been too stupid to see coming. When it was over, when Diego lay still on the concrete floor and Raphael stood over him with blood on his knuckles, the warehouse felt impossibly quiet. Maria was crying, great heaving sobs of relief and terror, and Valentina held her close while trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Raphael had killed for her, not in the heat of passion or the confusion of battle, but with cold, calculating precision. He'd eliminated a threat to her safety the way he might have eliminated any other business problem, and the ease of it should have terrified her. Instead, as she watched him check Diego's body and signal his men that the threat was neutralized, she felt nothing but gratitude and love and a fierce satisfaction that justice had finally been served. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling beside her and Maria with gentle hands that had just dealt death. "We're okay," Valentina said, and realized she meant it. They were okay, all of them, because Rafael Mendoza had kept his promise to protect what mattered to her. The ride back to the compound was quiet, Maria sleeping in the back seat, while Rafael drove with one hand and held Valentina's with the other. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched as if he was preparing for a blow. "You're thinking I should be afraid of you now," she said quietly, and his hand tightened on hers. "Aren't you?" he asked without taking his eyes off the road. "No," she said, and watched some of the tension leave his body. "I'm grateful. I'm relieved." I'm in love with you, and nothing about tonight changed that. Raphael pulled the car over on a deserted stretch of road and turned to face her, his green-gray eyes searching her face in the dashboard light. Everything about tonight should change that, he said. What I did to Diego, what I'm capable of, the world you'd be accepting if you stay with me. I know what world I'm accepting, Valentina said, reaching up to touch his face. I've known since the night I knocked on your door. The question is whether you're ready to accept mine. What do you mean? He asked. I mean I come with complications too, she said. I'll always put my family first. I'll always stand up for people who can't protect themselves. I'll challenge you when I think you're wrong and support you when I know you're right. I'm not going to be a quiet, decorative accessory to your life, Raphael. I'm going to be a partner. Raphael stared at her for a long moment, and then he was kissing her with desperate intensity, as if he was trying to convince himself she was real and there and choosing him despite everything. Marry me, he said against her lips, and her heart stopped. What? She breathed. Marry me, he repeated, pulling back to look into her eyes. Be my wife, my partner, my everything. Let me spend the rest of my life protecting you and loving you and trying to be worthy of the choice you made tonight. Valentina looked at this dangerous, beautiful man who had killed for her and would die for her, who had shown her a world she never could have imagined, and asked her to rule it beside him. The smart thing would be to take time, to think it through, to consider all the implications of binding her life to his. Instead, she said yes. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Valentina Cruz stood in front of a mirror in Raphael's bedroom, adjusting the delicate lace of her wedding dress and marveling at the woman looking back at her. The gown was simple but elegant, chosen not for its price tag but for the way it made her feel, beautiful, confident, and ready to step fully into the life she'd chosen. Today she would become Valentina Mendoza, wife to the most feared man in 3 states and partner in an empire built on both darkness and light. Sophia bustled around her, making final adjustments to the dress with the kind of maternal fussing that brought tears to Valentina's eyes. The older woman had become more than a housekeeper over the past 3 months. She'd become family, filling the void left by Valentina's own mother, who had struggled to accept her daughter's choice of husband despite seeing the way Raphael treated her with absolute devotion. You look beautiful, Mija, Sophia said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Raphael is going to forget how to breathe when he sees you. Is he nervous? Valentina asked, smoothing her hands over the silk skirt. Sophia laughed, the sound warm and knowing. That man has faced down rival cartels and federal investigations without blinking. But this morning he changed his tie 3 times and asked me twice if the flowers were right. The wedding was being held in the courtyard of the compound, transformed for the occasion with white roses and candles that turned the space into something from a fairy tale. It was small and intimate, just family and Raphael's closest associates. But Valentina had never wanted a big wedding anyway. She wanted something real, something that reflected who they actually were rather than who they were supposed to be. Maria appeared in the doorway, resplendent in her pale blue bridesmaid dress, and looking completely recovered from her ordeal 3 months earlier. The kidnapping had changed her, made her more serious and aware of the world's dangers, but it had also deepened her appreciation for family and the lengths people would go to protect those they loved. It's time, Maria said softly, and Valentina felt her heart skip with anticipation rather than fear. The walk through the house to the courtyard felt like a journey through her new life. The walls that had once seemed intimidating now felt protective. The men who nodded respectfully as she passed were no longer strangers, but guardians who had accepted her as their leader's wife and partner. The art that Raphael had collected with such care was now hers to appreciate and enjoy, a shared passion that had become one of the foundations of their relationship. But it was the sight of Raphael waiting for her at the altar that made everything else fade away. He was devastating in his black suit, but it was the expression on his face that took her breath away. Wonder and love and possessive satisfaction all mixed together in those green-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams since the first night she'd looked into them. This was Rafael Mendoza, El Lobo, the most dangerous man she'd ever met, looking at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd never dared to speak. The ceremony was conducted in both English and Spanish by a priest who had known Raphael's family for decades and understood that some unions existed beyond the boundaries of conventional society. When they exchanged vows, speaking words of devotion and protection and partnership, Valentina felt the final pieces of her old life fall away. She was no longer a woman seeking protection from a violent ex-boyfriend. She was Raphael's wife, his equal partner, a woman who had chosen love over safety and found both in the most unexpected place. When Raphael kissed her to seal their union, the kiss tasted like promises kept and futures claimed. The applause of their guests faded into background noise as she lost herself in the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The reception flowed seamlessly into the evening, with food that honored both their cultures and music that made even Raphael's most intimidating lieutenants smile and dance with their wives. Valentina found herself moving through the celebration like a queen holding court, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who had become her extended family. But it was the arrival of Raphael's mother that marked the true acceptance of their union. Elena Mendoza was a small, elegant woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had flown in from Michoacán specifically for the wedding, bringing with her the weight of family approval and tradition. When she embraced Valentina and whispered in Spanish that she was proud to welcome her as a daughter, Valentina felt tears spring to her eyes. "You make him happy," Elena said later as they sat together watching Raphael dance with Maria. "I haven't seen him like this since before Isabella died. You brought him back to life." "He saved mine first," Valentina replied, and meant it completely. The months that followed their wedding fell into a rhythm that surprised Valentina with its normalcy. Yes, Raphael's work involved activities that existed outside the law, but their daily life was filled with the same small intimacies that any married couple might share. Morning coffee and quiet conversations about their plans for the day. Evening dinners where they discussed books and art and politics. Weekend drives through the desert where they could be alone with the vast sky and each other. Valentina had returned to teaching, but at a private school that operated under Raphael's protection. Her students were children from families connected to his organization, kids who deserved the same chance at education and growth as any other child. The work was fulfilling in ways she'd never expected, allowing her to use her skills while staying safely within the boundaries of Raphael's world. She'd also found herself taking on an unexpected role as Raphael's conscience, the voice that reminded him that power came with responsibilities beyond profit and territory. When decisions arose that affected innocent people, she was there to offer perspective. When opportunities for legitimate business ventures presented themselves, she encouraged him to pursue them. Slowly, carefully, she was helping him build something that could exist in both the shadows and the light. It was on a Tuesday evening 6 months after their wedding that the knock came. Valentina was reading in Raphael's study when she heard it, that desperate, insistent pounding that she recognized from her own midnight arrival. She looked up from her book to find Raphael already moving toward the door, his hand automatically checking for the weapon he always carried. "Let me," she said, rising to follow him. Raphael paused, his hand on the door handle. "It's not safe." "It's a woman," Valentina said, somehow certain despite having no evidence. "And she's scared, just like I was." They opened the door together to find a young woman, maybe 22, with dark hair plastered to her head by rain and desperation written across her features. She looked at Raphael with the kind of fear mixed with hope that Valentina remembered feeling, the expression of someone who had run out of options and was willing to bet everything on the devil they'd heard about in whispered stories. "Please," the woman said, her voice breaking. "I need Rafael Mendoza. I need El Lobo. Someone's trying to kill me, and the police won't help because my ex-boyfriend has connections. I heard you protect people sometimes. I can pay. I have money saved. I just need somewhere safe until I can figure out what to do." Valentina looked at Raphael and saw her own story reflected in his eyes. Another desperate woman, another violent man, another chance to use their power for protection rather than profit. "What's your name?" Valentina asked gently, stepping forward. "Carmen Ruiz," the woman said, her eyes darting between them. "I teach kindergarten in El Paso. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I didn't know where else to go." "Come inside," Valentina said, making the decision for both of them. "You're safe now. As they led Carmen into the warmth and safety of their home, Valentina felt the circle completing itself. She'd been where this young woman was, desperate and afraid and willing to trust a dangerous man because he was the only option left. Now she was on the other side, the one offering protection and hope to someone who needed both. That night, as they settled Carmen into the guest room that had once been Valentina's sanctuary, Raphael pulled his wife into his arms and held her close. "You're changing me," he said quietly. "Changing what this all means." "We're changing each other," she corrected, and felt him nod against her hair. 1 year after their wedding, Valentina woke to morning sickness and the certainty that their family was about to grow. She told Raphael over breakfast, watching his face transform from concern to wonder to fierce protectiveness in the span of seconds. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands already reaching for her as if she might disappear if he didn't anchor her to him. "I'm sure," she said, laughing at his expression. "3 tests, all positive. We're having a baby, Raphael." He swept her up in his arms then, spinning her around the kitchen while Sophia clapped and cried and scolded them both for being so reckless with a pregnant woman. But Valentina had never felt safer than she did in that moment, held by the man who loved her and surrounded by the family they'd built together. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, watched over by the best doctors money could buy, and protected by a security detail that made Valentina laugh with its thoroughness. Raphael became even more protective than usual, something she hadn't thought possible, hovering over her with the kind of devoted attention that made her feel like a precious treasure. Their daughter was born on a clear October night, exactly 2 years after the storm that had brought them together. Isabella Elena Mendoza came into the world with her father's green-gray eyes and her mother's determined chin, and Raphael cried when he held her for the first time. "She's perfect," he whispered, and Valentina knew he was thinking of the other Isabella, the sister he'd lost, and the daughter who would carry her memory forward. As she watched her husband hold their baby with hands that could deal death but touched their child with infinite gentleness, Valentina reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them here. 2 years ago, she'd been a frightened woman running from a monster, desperate enough to knock on the devil's door asking for salvation. Now she was a wife, a mother, a partner in an empire that was slowly transforming from pure darkness into something more complex. She taught children who needed protection and hope. She helped make decisions that affected hundreds of lives. She loved a dangerous man who had learned to be gentle because of her faith in his capacity for good. The knock on their door that night had been the beginning of everything. Not just her salvation, but his as well, a chance for both of them to become more than they'd ever imagined possible. Have you ever made a choice that terrified you but changed your life completely? Maybe you've stood at a crossroads between safety and love, between the known and the unknown, between who you were and who you could become. If you're reading this story and thinking about your own moments of impossible decisions, I want you to know that sometimes the most dangerous choice is also the most necessary one. Sometimes love really can transform everything, even the most unlikely hearts. Tell me in the comments if you've ever taken a leap of faith that led you to exactly where you needed to be. As Isabella slept peacefully in her arms and Raphael dozed beside them both, Valentina smiled at the woman she'd become. She'd knocked on a cartel boss's door at midnight asking him to kill someone for her. Instead, she'd found the man who would die for her, live for her, and love her with a devotion that transformed them both. Some fairy tales, she thought drowsily, begin with running toward the monster instead of away from him. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you discover that the monster has been waiting his whole life for someone strong enough to see the man underneath.